Welcome to Monocle on Fashion, a show on Monocle Radio uncovering the inner workings of the fashion industry. I'm your host, Natalie Theodosi. On today's show, ahead of the US inauguration, we decided to do something a bit different. And instead of looking forward, as we tend to do in fashion, we're looking back at the most impactful presidential sartorial choices and the messages they transmit to the public. Fashion is often dismissed as frivolous, but in the political arena, it's an effective soft power tool. What one wears speaks volumes, and political figures have always known this. From George Washington being sworn in wearing a locally sourced and modest suit that countered the excesses associated with European royal ceremonies, to Ronald Reagan's stroller suit of 1981, which ushered in a decade of pleasure. What one chooses to wear at their inauguration conveys a message about their intentions for office. To tell us more, Monocle on Fashion's producer, Lily Austin, spoke to fashion historian Summer Ann Lee, a professor at the Fashion Institute of Technology and author of the forthcoming Presidential Fashion, An Illustrated History.
There has been a lot of writing and exhibitions on the fashion choices of the first ladies, but not so much about the presidents. I'm not going to say that no one's ever written about what presidents wear, because that's not true. And if that were true, then it would be impossible to write the book that I'm writing. But there is this reputation that fashion and having an interest in fashion is feminine, is frivolous, and really conflicts with the ideas of what the president of the United States is meant to be. We have yet to have a president who's not a man. So these men who are president are meant to be very serious and, masculine and manly, and not be interested in such silly things that women are interested in. So I just have a feeling that it has to do with that, and that these presidents are meant to be, evaluated. Obviously, that many of them have so many biographies, you could never read all of them. So they're fervently studied, but their fashion choices are sort of seen as, well, maybe that's superficial, maybe that's not important. So I'd love to sort of reevaluate that myself.
The subtext of what you're saying then is that it is important and there is significance in what these political figures choose to wear. What is that significance to your mind?
I see the significance of what a United States president wears as being sort of threefold. They can all be evaluated on these three different levels that they're expressing. So first you have just simply the time period, the time that this president is living in and, serving in office. Then you also have the requirements of the office. So just simply the fact that in the job as president, you're going to be wearing a lot of formal business wear, or, you're going to be doing a lot of diplomatic things. So the nature of the job. But then finally, you have this element of the person's personality, their individuality, their preferences, if they're interested in fashion, if they're not interested in fashion. So you have these three different levels that can kind of explain all of those choices and explain the significance of the choices. And when you compare one president's clothing versus another, those are the levels you can compare.
Okay, well, let's get into some specifics of some actual presidents. So I understand that your research goes all the way back to George Washington. Did he establish any trends with the first inauguration that have carried through until today?
Absolutely. George Washington really set the mold, both for what it meant to be a United States president, because of course he was the first one. There was no such thing before 1789 upon his first inauguration. But of course, he also set the mold for what does a president wear and what does he wear to his inauguration. So the trend that he really set was First, of course, the early United States was trying to contrast itself against the monarchies of the European courts, in particular England and France. So, of course, he did not want to be king, and he did not want to signal any sort of court-like splendor with his clothing. But it's also important to recognize that George Washington was a hugely heroic military figure at this time, and he often did wear his military uniform throughout his life, even after the Revolutionary War. But he did not choose to wear that military uniform to his inauguration because he was not going to be a militaristic ruler. So instead, what he wore was a suit of, quote, elegant broadcloth of the manufacture of his country. So in doing that twofold, he wore this relatively plain brown suit that didn't have any sort of insignia that, symbolized his power. But he also wore the suit that was of American textile manufacture. And early on in the 1780s, there was not a lot of elegant cloth that was being produced in the United States. There was still a lot of cloth that was being imported from Europe or from China. But he really intentionally wanted to wear this American-made suit to signify his patriotism and his commitment to American industry. So Washington's choice really did set the mold for a very long time in terms of inauguration fashion being austere. So we do have an example here. I'll just share. In 1829, that's when Andrew Jackson was inaugurated, and the press at the time shared that he wore plain dress and that it, quote, formed a gratifying contrast between the economy, simplicity, neatness, and chaste taste of Republican Americans with the gaudy decorations of European court and manners. So it was very, very important for Americans, especially American politicians, to feel that they were in contrast to the gaudiness of European courtiers, I suppose. The one example that comes to mind of a president sort of bucking at this is actually Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan's first inauguration, he chose to really go very, very formal, and he wore something called a stroller suit to his inauguration, and in advance of the ceremony sort of shared with the other politicians who were invited to the ceremony how they could purchase a stroller suit and what the different elements of the stroller suit were. And everyone's head was just spinning. Like, what is this man talking about? If we're all wearing these weird stroller suits, like the American people are just going to think that we're also out of touch with, the plight of regular Americans. This is so weird. So I don't think everyone did purchase the stroller suit, but Ronald Reagan was, and his wife Nancy, they both loved fashion and sort of glitz and glamour. Ronald Reagan, having formerly been a Hollywood actor, really appreciated, what image making could do for you. So if you look at pictures from that inauguration, he is very much in his element, but some other people might look a bit uncomfortable.
And what was the reception to that? Were the press kind to his choice of look?
Well, I have read some press that was just quite excited that Ronald and Nancy Reagan, although they were not nearly as young as John F. Kennedy and Jackie Kennedy, there was a bit of a comparison to, well, these are two very fashionable, glamorous people entering the White House. And so for the fashion industry, this might actually be a really wonderful blessing that we've got these really attractive celebrities, and that sort of whole era of Ronald Reagan is remembered as a period of like excess and greed, not just in the United States, but sort of globally. It's that time that's a bit more conservative. So he was thought to be that sort of dress for success icon of the day.
I'm very interested in this idea that what you choose to wear can transmit a political message of some kind. Do you have any other examples of presidents or indeed first ladies making a choice for inauguration to try and convey a particular message?
Yeah, another one that comes to mind is Dwight D. Eisenhower's inauguration. He was elected twice, so at both of his inaugurations, he chose to wear a Homburg hat instead of a top hat, and he was really the first president to do so since the top hat had been invented. And he was also a Republican president, but it was considered that he was sort of doing away with this stuffiness, this old time stuffiness of the days of when presidents wore top hats. He just wanted to wear his preferred style, which was considered a bit more casual. The Homburg is like a floral fedora, but it just has a dent down the middle. And it was really commented upon at the time that he was breaking with this mold, but it was doing the opposite of what Ronald Reagan had done with his stroller suit. He was becoming a bit more casual, which did appeal to everyday Americans because average American men did not own a top hat. And they had no occasion to wear a top hat too, but they probably did have a Homburg hat.
So I wanted to ask you about the choice of designer and how significant that is. What makes the right designer for an inauguration? Is it just down to them being an American citizen, or is there more to it than that?
It has become very important, especially over the years, for what the president and the first lady wears to be something that is created from an American brand. And certainly the designer does not need to be born in America. And actually, very commonly, they aren't. So, for example, you do have the example of Gabriella Hearst, who comes to mind first because she was recently on your podcast, or also Jason Wu that Michelle Obama worked with. But you also have some sort of American legacy brands. Ralph Lauren is very much becoming that, and also Brooks Brothers. This is important for President and First Lady to really show their commitment to the American economy and to American talent, like homegrown talent, essentially. So something that I came across sort of by accident, I came across this really interesting story where John F. Kennedy was being really scrutinized by the American press because he and his vice presidential candidate, Lyndon B. Johnson, had just purchased a number of suits from Savile Row in London. Now, of course, Savile Row is very much historically a menswear capital for the world, and John F. Kennedy being of upper class means, growing up in Boston, that Ivy League style, it must have been really impressed upon him that the best suits were made in Savile Row, and so much so that he convinced Lyndon B. Johnson to do the same. And the tailor, who is John Morgan and Company, kind of blabbed to the press. He kind of did the uncouth thing of bragging that he was dressing John F. Kennedy, and if he's elected president, I bet he'll wear one of my suits to his inauguration. And oh my gosh, the American press had this field day interviewing tailors. Tailors were saying, I'm not going to vote for him anymore. He's lost the tailors' vote because, you can get suits that are just as good in the United States. Why would you go abroad to London to get your suit? So it really seems to be deeply personal at times for presidents and first ladies to overlook American tailors or American designers in favor of European designers.
And bringing it up to the inauguration that is coming in a few days, what do you think Trump transmits with his choices of fashion?
Yeah, so I will say that in recent years, I don't see the political party of the candidate having a huge sway over their fashion sense or, the first lady's fashion sense. But what it really does come down to is the individual's personality and the individual's taste. And Donald Trump has a very, very specific way of dressing. It seems like he really sort of solidified his clothing sense in maybe the 1990s. There's this moment in an episode of Friends from season 4, which would have been in the 90s, where they make a joke. A character comes in wearing a bright blue blazer, and Chandler says Donald Trump wants his blue blazer back. So from that point on, Donald Trump is very well known for the sort of bright blue suit, the crisp white shirt, and the bright red tie. And obviously he does absolutely wear other outfits, but that's sort of his iconic look. And of course you have the symbolism of red, white, and blue. But he's also known for wearing this sort of oversized suit look, which again, I do imagine might have to do with 1990s style, because the sort of big baggy suit was very much the thing in the 1990s. And he is often sort of criticized for wearing a very long tie, a tie that's considered too long by menswear experts. But some intel has sort of come out that he might believe that a longer tie is sort of slimming for a man. So it's interesting that perhaps he wears his tie so long because he thinks that it's flattering that way.
And just finally, do you have any predictions for this Monday in terms of sartorial choices for any of the guests at the inauguration?
I am really going to be keeping my eye out for designs by Ralph Lauren at the inauguration this year. Ralph Lauren was recently made the first fashion designer to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And I find it really interesting that Ralph Lauren dressed President Joe Biden for the 2021 inauguration, but also dressed Melania Trump in the 2017 inauguration, which also really shows that I could either say bipartisan or nonpartisan element of the Ralph Lauren brand, that they're not into politics. So especially given that he very recently won that award, I imagine that they're going to really want to hold on to that relationship with the White House. So I'm going to be looking out for anyone wearing Ralph Lauren, whether it's Donald Trump, whether it's Melania Trump again, or anyone else.
That was fashion historian Samaran Lee speaking with Monocle on Fashion's producer, Lily Austin. So I'm now joined in the studio by Lily alongside Confect's deputy editor, Chiara Rimella, to broaden out the discussion. As Lily highlighted in her interview, I think fashion soft power and the way politicians use it has been a conversation that's ongoing for centuries. But I think it's really interesting now that images are disseminated so much faster to talk about how they shape our perceptions and even impact our politics. What are your takes? Chiara, share your initial thoughts.
Well, I think it's really interesting, and, we'll get onto it, but we do have a few pictures of women on our table today that we're going to be discussing. And for many, many years, decades, people in power, people in politics were primarily men in suits. And there was a limited amount of how much freedom you could have with that. And even the tiniest little detail was perceived as a signifier, whilst the first ladies could shine through much more elaborate and sometimes extravagant outfits. When you look back at former inaugurations, there are some really quite bold looks over the years. But as more and more countries elect their first female prime ministers, suddenly you're looking at the way that uniform of the suit gets adapted and changed, and the way that the hallmarks of power in that respect. Obviously female politicians, thankfully, have been in the ranks for a very long time, but I'm talking about the top job here and what it means to really take the top job, and how taking that sometimes changes the way that you dress compared to how you did when you didn't have the top job. Overall, I think that it's a huge signifier, but that impacts our perception in a way that just goes beyond what we even are willing to admit to ourselves.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting, the point you make, because in my mind, this idea of having to put on a big 80s suit to be taken seriously and as a signifier of power is quite antiquated. And I thought women can dress in a more feminine way, whether they're politicians or women in the C-suite. But it seems like it keeps coming back. But let's have a look back at history and at some of our highlights from different inaugurations. I think we each picked a different figure that stuck with us. So let's start with you, Chiara. Tell us who you chose and why it's a look that's interesting to you.
Well, you won't be surprised to hear that I went with Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. But I do think that there is something really interesting, and I'm referring particularly to her inauguration look as a signifier for her political career in general. So when she was campaigning, Giorgia Meloni used to wear a lot of pastel colours, skirts, pleated skirts, also sandals. She does have a very refined sense of dress, actually. Nowadays that she has been in office for a while, she's also been wearing pinks sometimes. She is very famous for the power suits. But notably, on her inauguration day, she went for a very, very, very austere, not very tailored suit at all, quite a baggy sort of black suit with a white shirt for the initial kind of ceremony, which is called like the Little Bell ceremony. And I'll show you a picture of it here. She wore it paired with these low brogues, very masculine again, like lace-ups, big platform at the bottom, sort of like a not quite baggy, but still not very tailored suit. But I think also, again, very, very interestingly, you have the photo of the cabinet of her own whole ministers. And there are women in her cabinet that frequently will go for a much more eccentric way of dressing. But on the day, they all wore pantsuits. None of them is wearing a skirt. Of course, she isn't. I think this is really interesting, not only in the context of what she was wearing before, much more inverted commas, kind of feminine dressing, but during so much of her campaign, she made a big point about gender identity, right? One of her most famous speeches said in Italian, I am Giorgia, I am a woman, I am a mother, I am Christian. There is no, it's not a subtle hint at kind of, making a point that there are two separate genders and this is what you can be and what you can't be. And then, as soon as she did take office, she showed up on the day dressed in a very, very, very masculine way and insisted that she be called in Italian il presidente. This is something that made the headlines at the time. This doesn't translate in English quite so well, but because you can say the president, right? But in Italian, you can say either il presidente or la presidente. Il being masculine, la being feminine, it's the article. She deliberately asked to be called il presidente. So it gives you an indication of how there is still an association with kind of masculine behavior and power. She has since softened this sort of look, but she still always goes for like very, very pared back, and more often than not, pantsuits over anything else.
Why do you think the big shift?
It's difficult to say, but I think that ultimately when push comes to shove, there is an inherent, I think, traditionalism to the way that she thinks about things. And even, lots of people were very excited when she got elected because she was the first female prime minister in Italy. And it felt like such a big move forward for women and feminism. But just because you're a woman, it doesn't mean that you're a feminist. She still identifies womanhood in its traditional markers. And so if manhood is what's associated with power, then you have to act like a man.
And from Italy, let's go to Mexico.
Yes.
Lily, you chose someone that dresses very differently, someone with a very different background. Talk us through the look and the woman that you chose.
Yes, I was going to say this is a big contrast to Giorgia Meloni because I picked Claudia Sheinbaum, who is Mexico's first female president. She was elected in June last year, and she opted for something very different. I feel like Giorgia Meloni's move was very reminiscent of Margaret Thatcher in this country. She had the same approach to dressing once she took office to try and replicate the masculine look. But this inauguration outfit that Claudia's worn is very different. It's an ivory dress, an A-line skirt, and then it is decorated on the skirt and also on the sleeves with these crocheted flowers. And that is a traditional technique that is used by Oaxaca artisans. And this particular artisan, Claudia Vasquez Aquina, who designed it, she's actually created quite a few looks for Claudia Sheinbaum, but didn't know, she wasn't told that this was going to be the inauguration look. It was just commissioned. And it's a very beautiful dress, and I think obviously was very intentionally chosen to kind of express the intention of this new president to try and be a voice for the people. That is how she's been described. During the election, that was how she was kind of positioning herself. And very much, with choosing to use this kind of technique to commission an artist to create this kind of dress with these traditional techniques, it kind of speaks to that. And I just liked seeing a dress, really. You don't always see that. And such a kind of classic feminine shape was kind of a nice change, a nice departure from the tradition.
I think it's really interesting she's wearing white. It feels quite kind of wedding gown to me almost.
Yeah, that's true.
Can you see that?
Yeah, I hadn't even thought of that, but
and
you're right.
Celebratory, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
No, it's a great example, I think, of when we talk about soft power. This is an actual example of using it and using your position to also highlight cultural heritage without even saying anything.
Yeah, and definitely just femininity, because, yeah, you're right, it is like a wedding dress, and it is such a contrast to what you expect to see, traditionally of a president or a national leader.
And I wanted to talk about the First Lady of Lebanon, Nimat Aoun, given that it's such an important moment in history. After years of instability, Lebanon now has a new president, and she has come to represent this sense of stability and humility. She spoke about being the everyday Lebanese woman, a mother, a daughter, and wanting to really represent people. She gave a very positive, encouraging statement about rebuilding the south of Lebanon, which is where she's from herself. And I think that does also come across in her look. For her husband's inauguration, she wore this black and white suit that still had this extra touch, these larger embellishments, which does represent, I think, the way Lebanese women like to dress. There's always a touch of glamour, something that is a little bit over the top. Her hair is done perfectly. And there was such a positive response with people saying that she reminds them of their glamorous Lebanese mother or auntie. And hopefully this is a positive story, I think, that will continue, and that she will use her position to highlight a lot of the Lebanese brands that are trying to find their feet again, from people like Sandra Mansour, Super Yaya, which are all still based in Beirut. Just to kind of wrap it all up, as we wait for Trump's inauguration on Monday, any predictions as to what we're going to see, both in terms of his fashion, which is equally interesting and controversial, and Melania's choices as well?
But I don't think that he's going to change the score, is he? Surely he's just going to stick with, if it ain't broke. I think that he's going to continue dressing almost like an effigy of his former powerful self. I reckon he's just going to go for the red tie again,
I think so. I mean, it's part of the marketing success formula, whether we like it or not, right?
Exactly. So I don't expect any major upset from him. I do wonder if she's going to go a bit less classic this time, because last time she went really Jackie.
I think she loves Jackie. She's going to stick with the Jackie O look.
And
I mean, everyone does. I feel like Jackie was the most influential.
And it fits. I think they stand for a more traditional version of femininity and values. So it does fit that whole image of referencing the past and more old school looks.
What about the bowl, though? Do we reckon that she's going to push the boat out at the bowl?
Well, in the press, it's been reported that she's going to wear a look that will go down in history. So I'm really hoping that she leans back into the slogan look that there was so much press about when, if you remember, in 2018, she visited migrants at the Mexican border and wore this H&M jacket with the slogan, "I don't care, do you?" written on the back. And I know that in her memoir, she very fiercely defended that, saying it was meant to be a message to the press, not to the migrants. So I'd love her to try and reclaim that and have like a dress with like huge slogans on it.
I mean, we're speaking about fashion as a soft power tool, but I think in the case of Trump's and the use of bold red, all the slogans, it's a much more aggressive use of fashion as a marketing tool. So I wouldn't put it past them. Who knows?
Let's see if Lily's slogan prediction comes true. A little Victor and Rolf type of moment.
And that's all for today's show. Make sure you subscribe and stay tuned for more big interviews and exclusive insights into the world of fashion. Today's episode was produced and edited by Lily Austin. I'm Natalie Theodosi. Thank you for listening.